In previous units, we talked about perceptual distortion and attitude formation and how difficult it is for employers and employees to kind of get close together to share a common language and a common sense of reality of what's going on. Well, to add to our problems as managers, the very same thing happens when you put clusters of people together. Something happens in this. Something happens that makes management and organizational integration very difficult. What happens is dynamics get started. In every one of these blocks, groups begin to form. People are thrust together trying to accomplish organizational tasks because the organization demands that they do so. They may not like each other, but they're all in the same department, they're all at the same desk, they're all trying to do the same thing. When you put any group of human beings close together, an interesting group dynamic gets started. The first thing that happens when people come together is that they interact. Out of interaction comes sentiment, good feeling, because people like to interact. We are social animals. When you think about it, you don't know if you're short, fat, tall, or not until you bounce yourself off other people. So there's interaction that leads to sentiment. Sentiment leads to consensus, that sense of us here in the lab, or in the back room, or in records. And out of that sense of consensus comes norms. Norms are ways of acting. Norms are the thing that drive managers to distraction. The purpose of norms is very functional in this group dynamics model. They hold the group together. Without norms, without agreeing on the way we're going to interact with each other, groups couldn't exist. One of the problems that managers have is we don't know what norms are going on at any one time. You see, very often, managers don't control this process of group dynamics. It happens whenever you throw human beings together. Do you remember the Hawthorne studies when we talked about women on a production line and they kept increasing productivity no matter what management did to the lighting? And it wasn't lighting at all, it was just the chance to remain together in a group that was giving those women something that management simply couldn't provide. It was giving them status, it was giving them affiliation. Not being one of the 500 women on a line meant a lot to those 5 women in a particular group. In the same study, another experiment was conducted with a group of men who were charged with making these huge telephone banks. It's called the famous bank wiring room experiment. These men were organized in a formal organization with a boss, with 2 assistant bosses, and 11 employees. They were paid on a group piecework basis. In other words, the more of these things they made, the more the whole group got paid. An observer was told to go down there and observe these people at work, and surely they must be making as many of these things as they could, because obviously rational, intelligent, healthy human beings would want to earn as much as they could. Well, the observer came back a month later and said to management, you have a problem. These people could make approximately 25% more of these huge telephone banks than they're producing right now. No one could understand why until the observer said, I'll tell you why, because this person right here tells them not to. And he's the boss. And for the first time in the management literature, we coined a new expression. The expression was informal organization. Down there in Section B, there was another company that chose its own bosses, had its own leaders, established its own norms, or levels of production in this case, and management didn't control it at all. What we found out later was the workers thought, being perfectly rational, that if they increased productivity, management would change the rate. One of the interesting things that happened in that study was the workers enforced norms. Psychologists call it norm sending. And the way you norm send is very interesting. In their case, they did a thing called binging. Now, if somebody was working too hard, expanding the level of production above the norms of the group, members of the group played a game called binging. It used to be called a noogie when I was a kid, and you'd walk up if you were 8 years old to another 8-year-old kid and hit him on the arm with a knuckle that looked like that. And if he didn't flinch, he could hit you on the arm. Everybody in the work group in the bank wiring room wanted to play binging with the rate buster. If management doesn't take charge of norms, the group will take charge of norms for you. They'll also take charge of something else if you're not careful. They may take charge of the morale process. Remember the group dynamics model with interaction, sentiment, consensus, and norms? Well, that's like an electrical generator. One of the things that spits out of that generator is the force or the energy of morale. You can harness morale, like an electrical circuit or electrical power, and drive it to increase productivity and enhance quality. Or, if you don't take charge of it, it becomes a hot wire that can burn you. What is morale? Let's play word association for a moment. What's morale? And I bet some of you are saying spirit, pride, energy, esprit de corps. Well, calling morale esprit de corps is a little bit like being a dermatologist. You have a red rash in your arm and you go to a dermatologist and he says, oh, homo son of a bitchicus. We see a lot of that this time of year. He gives you some salve, charges you 35 bucks, and after a while the rash goes away. And then you discover, as I did, that homo son of a bitchicus really means red rash on the arm, just the way esprit de corps means morale. But the French have the same problem with understanding and harnessing morale that we do. Let me tell you what psychologists say morale is. Congruent motivation to achieve a common goal. Sounds a little bit like homo son of a bitchicus. Congruent motivation to achieve a common goal. It's shared, it's powerful, it's a team or group concept, and it has a goal. But the goal may not be the goal of management. For example, I wonder how many of you have been involved in a strike, as a striker or a strikee. How's morale the first day of the strike? The strikers are all out there building bonfires, eating sandwiches, singing songs, beating up truck drivers in the parking lot. I bet morale's sky high, congruent motivation to achieve a common goal, but the goal is to shut down the organization. It may not be management's goal. You know, we never paid a lot of attention to this concept of morale historically. This is a copy of the 1922 Management Handbook. In this fat little book of almost 2,000 pages, there is 1/2 page devoted to the concept of morale. And all it says is that managers should organize athletic teams. Get the employees out in the athletic field so they'll be physically fit, they'll be energized, and implied in this, when they come back off the field, management can cream a little bit of that energy off the top to drive machines and increase productivity. Should you worry about morale as a manager? Sure. Should you worry about it all the time? Possibly not. For example, I took a group of students one year to a brewery to take a tour, to take a look at different kinds of technology, and the management of the brewery is going to meet us and take us around. Before the management arrived, we started the tour without them. They took us to one section of the brewery where they were brewing the beer. 9-story tank of beer, all brewed by computer. The only manual labor that was done was that a fellow came on at intervals, dressed in a clean white uniform for all the people taking the tour, and when a red light came on, he'd take a red plastic barrel and pour it into the top of this 9-story tank of beer. Then when a blue light came on, he'd take a blue plastic barrel and pour whatever was in it into this tank of beer. If you're the manager of that guy at the top of the tank, do you really care about his morale? As long as he doesn't throw the barrel in with the stuff into the barrel, to hell with his morale. You're going to get 9 million gallons of beer. But then they took us to another part of the plant, the bottling part. Totally different world. It was kind of like the 9th level of hell. We came out to a balcony. We looked at this huge floor awash with beer. See, that's where they're putting the beer in the bottles. And some of the beer doesn't get in the bottles all the time quite rightly. So they have people who do nothing more than walk around the line and pull out a half-filled bottle of beer and toss it over their shoulder into these dumpsters. Well, they miss half the time. There's beer over everything. When we were there, it was wintertime, so there were cold blasts of air coming in and out every time they opened the garage doors. It was awful down there. People were in hip boots, broken glass. It smelled like a brewery. It was terrible. Management finally caught up with us. One of my students holding his beer turned to the vice president of personnel and said, "Boy, you must have a real morale problem down there." And the vice president of personnel said, "Down there? Morale problem? Some of those people have been down there 15 years. Every year they win the local softball league championship. Their tight productivity is high. They didn't have any morale problems down on the floor." And when we stopped to look carefully at what was going on down at that floor, we discovered a very interesting lesson related to morale. It was the only place in the whole organization where management didn't go. They didn't want to get down there and get beer all over their shoes, so they were forced to create their own systems of how the work was going to be done. As you think about the morale concept, keep in mind the fact that there are places in your organization where less management may be better management. Think of a time, for example, where you've really seen a work group perform, where you've really seen them outclass and outpace themselves. I bet you're probably thinking about a time of crisis, about a non-traditional kind of time. And during those times, management is different. I often ask executives around the world who have been in the military, and especially those who have been in combat in the military, if they had a choice of working in an organization that functioned like a combat military unit, or working in an organization that functioned like a peacetime military unit, which organization would they rather work in? People always say the same thing. It's almost 100%. All of us who have been in combat units always say combat. And they do it quickly, and they do it with passion. Why? It was a time in our lives where we were most scared, most dirty, the hygiene factors were the worst, but we say combat. And the reason for that is, when you ask and analyze it, is one of the few times in our lives where organizations had clearly defined goals, clearly defined objectives, where the bottom of the organization had clearer goals than the top. The generals are saying, where the hell are we, Belgium or France? More wine. And the privates are saying, that hill. It was a time in our lives where we really felt the power of group dynamics. Heavy emphasis on team, on us. Remember, a combat unit is kind of like a clock. Everybody's got a part, and if any part screws up, the whole thing stops. It really doesn't matter if you're a captain or a sergeant or a private. You all have to work together. That kind of functional interdependence breeds great psychological interdependence. Edmund Burke, the Englishman, said once, "To love the little platoon we belong to in society is the first principle of public affection." People who've been there know that to love the little platoon you belong to in combat is the first principle of survival. You make friends, you build relationships, and people make sacrifices that last a lifetime. What's communication like in a combat unit? Two-way. Now, I know you've all seen the movies, and I know you saw John Wayne with a green beret yelling, "Take that hill!" And 300 zombies got up, and they took that hill. That really isn't the way it happens. What really happens in combat organizations is that some junior manager gets up and says, "Take that hill!" And 300 veterans get up and they say, "That hill? How about that hill?" There's a great ebb and flow of communication. We know where we got to go. We're talking all the time, and we're close. There's very little status differentiation in combat-like units. Status differentiation, now that I'm a psychologist, sounds right. At the time, there was more leadership and less chickenship in combat than in more traditional kinds of organizations. And people who've had that experience with great passion will say, "Oh yes, I remember." And they're looking for the same kind of experience in organizational life. Can it happen? Possibly. Now, I realize it's an extreme example. I realize that people watching this are not in combat. You don't operate day to day in an environment that's hostile, threatening, exciting, and dynamic the way combat units do. Or do you? Every organization in competition, every organization in strain is in combat. The same dynamics happen to you that happen to us, and will go on unless, of course, some stupid second lieutenant manager prevents those dynamics from happening. For example, if you went to the Pentagon and asked to see a picture of a combat military unit, you would be given a table of organization. It may not have Vincent Price on the top, but it will surely have someone called a captain on the top. And the captain has 2 or 3 lieutenants, and the lieutenants have a bunch of sergeants, and the sergeants have a bunch of corporals, and so on, all the way down. It's 14 inches high. It looks like all the tables of organization you've ever seen. It's tall, it's narrow. And then you go to Boondock, Vietnam, or Boondock, Belgium, or Boondock, France, wherever your Boondock is or was. Jump into some guy's foxhole and say, "Quick, draw me a picture of the way this organization works." And some guy will say, "Hold on a minute, buddy," and he'll rip off some paper off a can of sea rations, and he'll draw you a different kind of organization chart. He'll draw you a picture that looks like this. He'll start off by saying, "Well, we've got a boss, a captain, and then there's the rest of us." And he keeps his head down as much as he can. The picture that he draws you is flat. This is an organization under stress, an organization in crisis. It's like a biological system trying to survive in a very hostile environment. Managers in today's hostile environment have got to recognize the fact that one of their great roles is to help integrate, to help flatten this organization down from something that looks like this to something that acts like that. What you're really doing is guiding forces, the way a pilot does. When I was in pilot training, they used to tell student pilots that if ever we got into a spin in these training aircraft, and we couldn't break the spin, following all the rules, there was one thing a student pilot could do before you bailed out of that thing. It was to let go. When you let go of an airplane, if you have enough altitude, the airplane will eventually recover. And the reason that it will recover is that it's built that way. Kind of like work groups, airplanes are built to fly. Student pilots make them crash. And what is the most common problem of student pilots and student managers? Over control. Too much interference in the dynamics of the airplane. You see, You always need a pilot. You always need a manager. You need somebody who can strap it on in the morning and point it where it has to go and land it when it needs landing. That's what pilots do. That's what managers do. Pilots fly or guide the airplane. They don't make the airplane fly. Let's take some time now to see how you can make your work group fly in problem solving. Solving problems that are of concern to you.